In the hills, where the wind moves slow and the stones remember more than the men who walk on them, a monk stood before a loaf of bread, warm, familiar, and could not recall its name. Days later, a bell rang through the abbey's halls, but no one knew why. No sickness, no screams, just silence, and then forgetting. Tonight we step into a story unlike any you've heard, where memories vanish, not with violence, but with a softness so quiet it might almost feel like peace. Before we begin, let us know where and when you're watching from. Drop your location and time in the comments, and if you find yourself drawn in, like this video and subscribe for more stories that echo long after the final word. Because what happened within these walls was not an illness. It was something older, and it's still waiting to be remembered. In the hills, far from the reach of roads, where wind moves slower and birds speak softly, there stood an abbey. Stone-built and ivy-wrapped, it had rested in silence for generations. The monks who lived within its walls kept few records of the outside world. Their lives were measured in the rhythm of bells, prayers, and the slow passing of seasons. It began on a morning like any other. The bells had rung at dawn, echoing faintly across the dewy fields. In the kitchen, bread had been laid out, loaves shaped by careful hands, warmed by the oven's long breath. But when Brother Luke approached, he paused. His fingers hovered above the crust. He stared, and then softly he asked no one at all, "What is this called?" The word was gone, not just misplaced, but missing, as if it had never existed in his mouth at all. He ate in silence, and said nothing. By Vespers, another monk had forgotten the words to a prayer he'd recited every evening for 20 years. His voice fell quiet, halfway through a verse, the rest dissolving from memory like steam. He stared forward. His lips moved slightly. Nothing came. It was not thought to be anything at first. Tiredness, age, the dulling mind in the depth of winter. But the days passed, then weeks, and something stranger settled into the abbey's bones. The monks, who once moved with purpose, began to hesitate. They gathered in the refectory, but forgot which seat was theirs. They fumbled over daily rites. They wandered from room to room with vague intentions. Each face seemed to carry the faintest sense of loss. Not grief exactly, but the shape of something missing, like a page torn from a book. One morning, the name of the abbot, spoken aloud every day during morning prayers, was no longer known, not mispronounced, not misremembered, simply not there. No one stepped forward to say it. No one remembered who had held the title. The abbey. Stores, once open to travellers and pilgrims, were closed, locked from within. No messengers were sent, no letters posted. The outside world, unaware of what had begun, simply assumed the monks had taken another long vow of silence. Inside, the disease, if it could be called that, continued its silent work. It did not claim the body, no fevers, no rashes, no trembling hands. The monks remained upright, mobile, healthy. They ate, they walked, they sang, or tried to. But beneath the surface, something was changing, something essential, unseen. Names were the first to go, then the structure of language, then place, meaning. Even the passage of time began to feel vague. Days drifted into one another, like ink in water. The abbey, too, responded. The walls, once neat with scripture and notation, grew bare. Chalkboards, once filled with schedules, were wiped clean and never rewritten. The gardens became untended. The bells still rang, but at strange hours, sometimes not at all. At night, some monks stood beneath the stars, trying to recall constellations that once guided them in thought and faith. Now they were only lights in the sky. No names, no stories, just patterns they could not trace. By the time a neighbouring shepherd passed near the abbey and found it silent, every monk still breathed. They still moved, they still lived. But when he asked their names, none could answer. What had touched the abbey left no wounds, no visible scar. it passed quietly through the mind, leaving behind an emptiness so soft, so subtle, that it almost resembled peace. But something had been taken. And as the abbey slipped further into stillness, one question lingered like a distant bell in fog. If not illness, then what had happened here? The bells still rang. Though no monk could say why or who had last rung them, their chimes continued to echo down the empty stone halls at irregular hours, soft, hollow tones marking time that no longer held meaning. After the gates were shut and latched, no word escaped the abbey for weeks. From the outside, it looked unchanged. Vines still crawled across the cloister walls. Smoke rose gently from a chimney in the eastern wing. A garden gate creaked in the wind, but inside something was shifting. The abbey itself had been designed for rhythm, its long corridors and inner courtyards arranged like the hours of a day. Everything had its place, the kitchens in the south, the scriptorium tucked in quiet shade, the cells of the monks arranged around the central well, where water echoed against stone. Now that structure held them together like a skeleton. Though names had vanished and memory curled inward like paper near flame, the monks still moved, as if following muscle memory. Morning brought them to the refectory. They ate in silence, unsure of the day's name, sometimes forgetting to chew. Bowls were passed. Hands moved in familiar patterns, and then stilled. Emotion finished before the thought behind it arrived. The gardens grew wild. Lettuce bolted to seed. Lavender bloomed and withered untrimmed. Some monks would stand among the herbs, hands brushing against stems, as if something there might spark recognition. A name, a taste, a prayer. But there was only the wind and the low hum of bees that did not forget. In the scriptorium, pages lay blank. Ink dried in open wells. Occasionally, one monk would sit at a desk and stare at parchment, quill in hand. He would dip the pen, bring it to the page, pause, and then stop. No words came, not even shapes. The alphabet itself had unravelled, not all at once, but like threads pulled slowly from a robe. And yet the tuiles remained. They moved to the chapel at dusk. They sat in pews, eyes closed. No hymns were sung, no candles were lit, but they were there, as if the shape of their day depended on these acts. Even emptied of meaning, they offered a kind of scaffolding, a whisper of what once was. Some monks would walk the cloister in slow circles, lips moving soundlessly. Others stood in doorways, staring at murals on the walls, faces painted centuries ago. Saints, angels and martyrs, now looked down on them like strangers. Symbols that had once held purpose had become patterns, beautiful but mute. The abbey was quiet, but not empty. It breathed in strange ways, not with song or prayer, but with repetition. The shuffle of feet, the closing of doors, the echo of bells rung out of sync. A life still lived, but without identity. At night, the monks returned to their cells. They lay in beds that no longer felt familiar. Some held books they couldn't read. Others stared at their hands, as if searching for some memory held in skin and scar. And in that darkness, beneath the timbered rafters, a silence settled that was different than before. It was not peaceful. Not quite. It was the silence of something missing, not taken violently, but loosened. As if memory itself had been carefully unthreaded, so gently it left no mark. No monk could say what had caused it. No one remembered the beginning, and there were no names left to ask. But the abbey endured. It stood still in the hills above the world. Its rituals continued, its people remained. And deeper still, beneath the repetition, beneath the stone and the silence, something waited to be remembered, or forgotten completely. In the eastern wing of the abbey, just above the old root cellar and across from the long-disused cloister library, there was a cell with 3 narrow windows and a desk worn smooth by decades of use. This had once belonged to Brother Guillaume, the abbey's librarian. His role, before forgetting spread like smoke through the halls, had been to tend the collection, centuries-old texts, bound in calfskin and inked by hand, sorted not by title or author but by memory. A quiet understanding of where each belonged, who had copied it, which page had begun to flake with age. When the others began to lose words, Guillaume noticed. He watched the way their fingers hesitated before turning pages, the confusion in their faces at the sight of once familiar prayers. And though he, too, felt something slipping, a faint blur around names and numbers, he turned to the one thing he still trusted, ink. At first, his notes were simple, corded in tidy script, along the borders of hymnals, in the empty spaces between verses. A list of names, a date, a reminder to stoke the fire in the refectory before matins. But as the days wore on, the handwriting changed. The letters grew uneven, slanted. Lines began to crowd one another, as if he were trying to preserve too much in too little space. Whole pages bore overlapping annotations, arrows, circles, strange mnemonics he must have believed would trigger something when seen again. One page simply read, name, Guillaume, occupation, books, brothers, many. Morning is east. Another, if you forget the door, count the steps, 42 from well to my cell. What began as orderly preservation soon became something else. Not just memory, but identity, splintered and jotted down in margins. He began to write in unusual places, on the backs of candle moulds, on the wooden underside of a choir stall, even along the edges of window frames, where lights gauged fell at dawn, anything solid, anything that might survive the mind. There were gaps in the timeline, days with no entries, then frantic clusters. One small hymnal, tucked behind a loose stone in the scriptorium, was nearly blackened with writing, most of it illegible, the ink bleeding into itself, as if he had returned again and again, trying to hold on to a single thought that kept slipping through. The structure of his writing changed too. At first, sentences, then fragments, then words alone. Bread, west door, remember the spine. Memory is a room. Open, anchor, bind. One of the final notes, scratched faintly in the back of a psalter, showed a small diagram of the abbey, rough, almost childlike, with arrows pointing toward the library, the chapel, and finally to his own cell. Beside it, in thin, trembling letters, bind the thought, or it goes. That was the last sentence he left behind. After that, the margins were bare. His hand had either stilled or forgotten how to begin. When others came upon his notes, if they still had the will to read, they traced them like fossils, notations that once meant everything to their maker, now hollow and strange. Words left behind like breadcrumbs in a forest where no one remembered being lost. Guillaume was never seen after the 5th week. His cell remained intact, the desk untouched, the windows dusted with pollen. But sometimes when the light hit the hymnal pages just right, the faint outline of his markings returned, barely visible, almost erased, as though even memory once written could fade from the world. There was a bell in the abbey's southern tower, cast in iron nearly 3 centuries before the forgetting began. It was the highest of the bells, older than the timber that held it aloft, older than any name inscribed in the records of the monks who lived beneath it. A single word was etched along its side, faded now into rusted curls, resurgere, to rise again. It had a clear, pure tone, different from the other bells used for prayer, work, or mealtimes. Those rang in sequence. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, vespers with the evening light. But this bell, the high bell, had only one purpose. It was to be rung when a monk passed, once and only once, to guide the soul toward what lay beyond. But after the forgetting began, it fell silent. The tower steps were rarely climbed in those first few weeks. The days folded into one another, heavy and uncertain. Names were lost, faces became soft blurs. Yet even as the routines continued, meals, prayers, walks in the cloister, no one dared reach for the bell rope. Not even Brother Mathieu, the sacristan, whose task it once was to mark the hours and announce the dead. He had been the last to ring it before silence set in. A winter death. Brother Agnon, a man who had copied sermons in a hand so precise it was said you could read his pages in candlelight from 10 paces. After Agnon's passing, Mathieu stood in the tower, staring up at the great iron shape swaying gently in the wind. He rang it once, as was tradition. But something strange happened that morning. As the sound echoed across the hills, those who heard it below paused, not in mourning, but in stillness. A few turned toward the source with furrowed brows. Others covered their ears. One monk, nameless now, wept openly, unsure why. It was the first moment any of them had felt something sharp and unfamiliar beneath the haze. After that, Mathieu never rang it again. Some began to whisper. They said the bell pulled at something hidden, a thread deep in the mind, fraying further with each echo. Others believed the opposite, that its sound could recall what had been lost, like wind stirring leaves from under snow. But belief had become difficult to hold on to. The bell remained unmoved. Its rope, once dusted weekly, gathered cobwebs. Pigeons nested in the rafters above, cooing softly into the stonework. From the courtyard below it was still visible through the narrow arches, its shape like a shadow of time that no longer passed cleanly. Guillaume's notes, now scattered among the abbey's few surviving books, made mention of it only once, a scribbled line along the margin of an old breviary. The bell, memory's edge? Even that seemed more question than observation. In time, some monks forgot what the bell had been for entirely. They looked up and saw it as part of the building's bones, no more meaningful than the weathered walls or worn floor tiles beneath their feet. Yet a few, perhaps something deeper still flickering within them, continued to avoid the tower. They passed it with bowed heads. They never touched the door handle. Brother Mathieu disappeared not long after his final ascent. His sandals were found at the foot of the bell stairs. No note, no sign of struggle, only a faint layer of dust on the rope where his hand might have rested. The bell never rang again, but on certain fog-heavy mornings, when wind curled softly through the fields and touched the tower's height just right, a faint hum could be heard, low, hollow, like something waiting to be remembered. Or perhaps it was only the echo of silence made heavy by what had once been sound. The scriptorium of the abbey was once a chamber of quiet reverence, long wooden desks arranged beneath stained glass, where sunlight poured in gold and violet across ink-stained hands. It was here that monks preserved memory, scripture, lineage, the slow and sacred copying of time itself. For centuries, names and faces were kept alive by their careful hands, a birth recorded in curling script, a death marked in crimson and ochre. The margins of the manuscripts held not just prayers, but portraits, careful likenesses drawn beside initials, reminders of those who once breathed, worked, prayed, and then they began to change. It started with the margins, tiny initials that blurred, thin gold halos that flaked, eyelids smudged into soft shadows. At first it was assumed to be time, or moisture, or the quiet nibble of mice. But the decay was not uniform. It was selective. Whole pages remained pristine, unblemished by age or dust. But others, especially those pages that bore the names of monks still walking the halls, faded day by day, as if memory itself had turned its back. The scribes were the last to notice, or perhaps the last to admit. Brother Thomas, the master illuminator, had once taken great pride in his delicate detailing, the curve of a brow, the faint flush of a cheek, the subtle glint of recognition in the eyes of the men he drew. He returned to his older works often, retouching where time had faded the lines. But one morning he found something unsettling. A miniature he had painted the week before, a simple image of the choir monks gathered in prayer, was not as he remembered it. Their faces were gone, not worn, not smudged, but entirely blank, ovals of pale pigment, untouched and smooth. Beneath the scene, their names had once been listed, but now the script was scratched, interrupted midway by a hand that had lost its certainty. Only the first syll, Abel's, remained. B. Gu. Tom. The rest trailed off into a blur of ink. At first he tried to repaint them. He dipped his quill, steadied his hand, but each attempt slid across the surface as if repelled. The pigment would not hold. The parchment, once so receptive, felt smooth as stone, and worse, the image changed again the next day. Not only were the faces absent, but now even the robes were smudged, their outlines faded like shadows at dusk. In a locked drawer beside the central desk, a single sketch was found long after the abbey had fallen silent, unfinished. Drawn in faint graphite strokes, the figure wore the robes of the brethren, a soft hood, a bowed head, but no eyes, no mouth, just the suggestion of a face that had never been filled in. What made it more haunting was the posture. Unlike the others, this monk did not face forward, nor bow in prayer. He looked outward, slightly turned, as if watching the one who watched him. On the reverse of the parchment, a note. He has no name, but he remembers, we're forgetting. No signature. In the years before the last pages were penned, the scriptorium grew quieter. Pages turned more slowly. The candles, once kept trimmed and tall, flickered low, and when ink finally ran dry, none returned to the inkwells. The quills remained in place, but the shelves, once alive with colour and line, stood still, filled with books that remembered what the monks no longer could, books whose faces no longer smiled, whose names were only echoes of scratches in fading ink. Memory, it seemed, was not only leaving the mind, but fleeing the page. While the rest of the abbey faded, voices softening, identities dimming, there was one whose memory did not decay. In the far end of the eastern dormitory, among the youngest of the brothers, a novice named Etienne began to change in the opposite direction. At first it appeared as a gift. He was quiet, obedient, unassuming, but while the older monks forgot their names, Etienne remembered verses he had never been taught. He recited full prayers in Greek, though the abbey had not used that tongue in decades. He whispered forgotten psalms in Aramaic. He corrected ancient grammar in texts no one else could read. What began as curious praise turned quickly to quiet concern. The abbey's oldest manuscripts, bound in iron clasps and stored deep in the crypt library, were found open when they should have been sealed. Strange sigils drawn in the margins, pages turned, as if browsed by someone who knew exactly where to look. Etienne, too young to have ever descended alone, began to speak of histories no longer recorded, cities that had burned before Christ walked, symbols buried beneath centuries of ash. He spoke with detail, not as if he had learned, but as if he had remembered. Then came the visions. He stopped sleeping. His journal, a plain leather-bound volume left beside his bedside mat, began to change. Its early pages were neat, notes on routine, verses from prayer, small sketches of the abbey's gardens. But as the days passed, the writing darkened. Lines crossed themselves out, diagrams appeared, spirals, stars, and then memories, but not his. Descriptions of distant deserts he had never seen, temples broken by time, long corridors beneath stone cities filled with whispering mouths, memories that came not from his childhood, but from something older, as if the mind inside him had lived many lives, and each one was waking up. The monks began avoiding him. He spoke, less, but when he did, his words carried weight, too precise, too ancient. He recited events that had no record, and yet something about them rang true. He named constellations in pre-human tongues. He recalled the scent of dust blown over lost altars. The abbey, already collapsing inward under the weight of forgetting, began to feel smaller when Etienne passed through its halls. Some said his eyes changed colour in low light. Others swore they found pages flipped in their private books, pages Etienne could not have reached. Then, one morning, he was gone. No gate had opened. No footprints led into the woods. His robe, neatly folded, rested atop his cot, and on the desk beside it, his journal, opened to the final page. The words, sharp and clean, were written in a language not of this earth. It resembled nothing from the texts known to the order. Yet below it, scribbled in a trembling hand, were 3 words translated, "He is awake." The meaning was unclear. Some believed Etienne had been taken, not by force, but by calling. Others whispered that his memory had grown so vast, so ancient, it no longer fit within the walls of a mind shaped by flesh, that he had stepped into the world beneath the world, where memory sleeps before birth and returns after death. In the weeks that followed, the journal began to fade. Letters blurred, diagrams dissolved, only the last page remained untouched. The abbey did not speak of Etienne again, and yet, in the long hours before dawn, when the fog hung heavy and the bell refused to ring, some monks claimed they heard footsteps in the crypt, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking backward through time and remembering everything. After Etienne vanished, the silence within the abbey deepened. His absence, though unspoken, seemed to settle into every stone. It hung in the hallways like forgotten incense, faint and difficult to place, but undeniably there. The monks did not speak of him, not by choice, but by failing. Even the name began to dissolve. And so the days went on. The bell still marked the hours, footsteps still echoed across worn flagstones. And meals, routine, modest, reverent, continued, though reverence had long since faded. The refectory was always quiet, but now it was quieter still. Once, meals began with a shared blessing, a prayer murmured in unity before bread was broken. But as memory slipped, so did the words. The blessing shortened, then fractured, then disappeared entirely. Now they ate in silence. Hands moved from bread to bowl to lips as if guided by memory deeper than thought. No instructions were given, no signals exchanged, but the actions repeated as they always had, mechanical, faithful, ghost-like. At first, no one noticed when the taste began to dull. The bread still bore the marks of the baking stone, its crust cracked with heat, its crumb pale and soft. The stews still steamed. Herbs were still stirred into water drawn from the cold spring beneath the abbey floor, but flavour faded. Not all at once, and not for all, but it was as though the sense of taste grew distant, as if tongues no longer translated what the mouth held. The salt became neutral, the herbs indistinct. Only texture remained, grain, broth, root. Some monks, in secret corners of their journals, wrote of it. Words like bland, empty, lost appeared in the margins. One entry ended with a sentence scratched in tight, uneven hand. It fills, but does not nourish. And then came the labels. The kitchen inventory, kept in strict order since the abbey's founding, began to repeat itself, week after. For week, the logs showed identical meals, barley, lentils, black bread, turnip stew. Even in seasons when those foods were scarce, the entries remained unchanged, as though the record no longer captured fact, but only memory of fact. One monk, whose name was lost, but whose handwriting remained recognizable, began circling entries, marking repetitions. He drew lines between weeks, noting when the meals stopped changing. His final notation simply read, "Same again." The abbey's root cellar remained full, but variety was no longer sought. The hands that once chose ingredients now moved toward what was familiar, not by preference, but by instinct. The rhythm of repetition was safer than the uncertainty of choice. Language, too, continued to unravel. Words for flavor, sweet, bitter, sharp, faded first. Then came texture, smooth, soft, crisp. Eventually, even the word bread lost its weight. It was spoken less, then not at all. Meals became less a gathering and more a gesture, a habit performed in stillness. Bowls lifted, bread torn, water sipped, no blessing, no thanks, no conversation, just the motion of mouths remembering what the mind could not. And yet they kept eating, because something deeper than memory compelled them, not hunger exactly, but routine. The body, even when the mind forgets, continues. It follows the paths carved by habit, like water over old stone. The abbey's kitchen clock still ticked. Fires were lit, loaves baked, but no one asked why. No one questioned the sameness of it all. Even the youngest monks, barely grown into their robes, mirrored the others without ever knowing what came before. There was no rebellion, only the soft ritual of fading minds. And above the refectory door, carved into the wood centuries ago, the old blessing still remained, unread, unspoken, unremembered, a prayer to nourish what no longer could be named. The abbey, though quiet above, held greater silence beneath. Carved deep into the earth, beneath the stone chapel and cloister walks, lay the crypts, older than the abbey itself, some believed. There, among layers of carved limestone and damp shadows, generations of monks had been laid to rest. It was never a place of fear. For centuries the crypts were revered, visited only on feast days and remembrances. Names once echoed softly there, spoken in reverent tones, with candles lit to warm the dark. But in time, like so much else, the rituals fell quiet. The names were no longer read, the prayers no longer remembered, only the stone remained. No one had descended for many weeks, not since the fading began in earnest. The passages down to the crypts were cold now and thick with air that no longer felt like it belonged to the surface world. Lanterns left too long below would flicker strangely, and few felt the need to go that deep any more. But one monk did. He was not remembered by name, but his notes remained. A single page found pressed between two volumes in the abbey library, its ink smudged, its corners marked with oil and dust. It told of a sound, faint, rhythmic, low, like a breath drawn through hollow stone. He first heard it in the still hours before dawn, when the frost clung to the outer walls and the cloisters sat empty. He followed it. Down through the sacristy stairs, past the old iron gate, and into the narrowing halls of the crypts, where the air grew colder, where even the echoes forgot to return. There, he said, the voice was clearer. Not one voice, but many. Not shouting, not whispering, but singing, chanting. They sang in a tongue he could not name, and yet he recognized it, not from memory, but from sensation, like the remembered warmth of a fire long extinguished. The syllables trembled in the air like incense, weaving through the pillars of carved stone. Somewhere in those winding crypts the voice called him deeper. No record was made of his return. No one recalled seeing him again, but the page he left behind led to something more. Scratched into the wall, deep within the lowest vault, behind a broken sarcophagus lid, was a message, carved not with a tool but likely with a piece of broken stone. The writing was uneven, frantic, but clear. It read, "They pray because they were never told to stop." Beneath it, the stone bore shallow lines, not words, but musical notation, a sequence of chant tones, matching no known liturgy still in use. Scholars, later, would compare it to pre-Gregorian modes, unfamiliar but hauntingly precise. When played, slowly, reverently, it resembled a funeral mass, yet no one knew who it had been meant for. The abbey's archives, already crumbling, yielded one final thread, a fragment of parchment, centuries older than the rest, with a chant transcribed in near-identical form. The title translated loosely to "The Last Vigil for the Remembered." It was once sung only when a brother was buried without kin, without name, without witness. Perhaps the monks below had never been released from that vigil. Perhaps, in forgetting, those above had abandoned something essential. The crypts remain sealed now, not by fear, but by quiet understanding. No one disturbs the chant, no one records it again. It simply continues below the stone. And if one listens, in the deepest hour of night, when all other sound has died, they say you might still hear it, not with your ears, but with something older, something deeper, a memory that belongs not to you, but to the stone itself. A voice that remembers even when you do not. Night came softly over the abbey, cloaking its towers and courtyards in silver quiet. Among the many duties kept by the monks, the study of the heavens had always been a gentle one, contemplative, steady. From the narrow tower above the eastern cloister, generations had gathered to chart the movement of stars, to trace the curved paths of planets and name the lights that watched over them. For centuries the stars were familiar, old friends, unchanged, their positions marked and measured, their patterns woven into tapestries of story and scripture. The heavens were a book no one expected to be rewritten, but the forgetting reached even there. It began, as always, with small errors, a misnamed star on a chart, a forgotten cluster, a constellation drawn with lines that no longer fit. At first the mistakes were dismissed. Tired hands, fading eyes, the fatigue that came from too many sleepless vigils. But the errors spread. Charts once inked with clarity began to look wrong, not just in detail, but in form. The constellations lost their shapes. The great shepherd, whose staff had once guided travellers across centuries, now bent in the wrong direction. The river of saints, always flowing east, forked toward the north with unfamiliar branches. The monks grew uneasy, not from fear, but from quiet confusion. When they looked up, the sky itself seemed different, not darker, not empty, but somehow rearranged, as if the heavens had shifted while no one watched. Among the observers, one monk stood apart. His name had long since faded from the records, but his notes survived. Tucked inside a leather-bound journal, the pages bore no proper star names, only new ones, invented by a hand desperate to anchor what was slipping away. He called the stars what he felt them to be: the quiet mouth, the turning eye, stone above breath, each name unfamiliar yet haunting, like echo, airs of things never fully known. At the edge of one page he wrote, "These are not errors, the sky forgets too." His entries became more erratic. Symbols crept into the margins, circles within circles, jagged spirals, unplaceable glyphs. They were not part of any known astronomical system, and yet they repeated with precision, as though copied from something exact. Some believed he was transcribing visions. Others thought he was inventing an alphabet for a language the stars had begun to speak. Eventually his journal shifted fully into symbol and silence. No more words, just markings. And one final page, pressed tight against the back cover, bore only a single drawing. It showed a sky, blank, without stars, no caption, no lines, just emptiness. In the weeks that followed, the tower observatory was left unused. The telescope, once polished each dusk, gathered dust. The books of constellations remained open but untouched, their pages curling as if the ink no longer wished to be read. A few monks still looked up at night. Some saw only scattered lights, familiar in number, but wrong in name. Others swore the stars were moving, not across the seasons, but with purpose, gently, subtly, as if seeking something they had lost. No one could say what was true. Even now, long after the abbey fell silent, the star charts found in its ruins show signs of revision. Layers upon layers of erasure, names scraped away, lines redrawn. The sky above the abbey no longer reflects any known pattern. And in the tower, scrawled on the inside of the dome with what appears to be soot or burnt ink, are the same unfamiliar symbols from the journal, arranged in a perfect ring. Some believe they represent a memory not of this world, but of the space between stars, a memory that does not forget, only waits to be remembered. Even as the sky turned unfamiliar and the stars loosened from their names, the abbey continued its rituals in quiet resistance. Quills still scratched across parchment, though what they recorded was changing. In the small chamber near the refectory, where correspondence had once been handled with measured care, a curious archive began to grow, a collection of letters never sent. Dozens of them were discovered later, arranged not with purpose, but with a strange kind of abandonment. Some lay beneath stacks of hymns, others tucked into the spines of ledger books. A few had been sealed, but never addressed. Most remained unfinished. They began simply enough. Messages to family, reports to the bishop, or carefully worded appeals to the king. The earliest letters still carried the expected tone of monastic order, clear, precise, reverent. They spoke of silence descending over the abbey, of names fading from memory, of rituals continuing without meaning. There was confusion, yes, but also hope, a belief that the world outside still held shape, that someone would understand and respond. But as the weeks passed, the tone fractured. Sentences became uncertain, doubling back on themselves. Some writers seemed to forget who they were addressing halfway through. Others copied previous paragraphs word for word, as if caught in a loop they could not escape. Again and again, one phrase surfaced, often near the end. "We are still here. We are still." The sentence trailed off more often than not, as if the thought refused to complete itself. Some repeated it dozens of times in succession, the letters growing erratic, slanted or faint, as though the hand guiding them was no longer sure of its purpose. What made these letters most unsettling was not just their decay, but the fact that none of them were posted. The wax seals remained unbroken, or never applied at all. No date, no curious. As mark, they simply gathered in silence. Among the stack, one envelope stood apart. It was thick, sealed tightly with a wax emblem not used elsewhere in the abbey's record. The name on the front was written in a deep violet ink, darker than anything found in the other documents. The script was unfamiliar, fluid, sharp, and strangely graceful. The name it bore did not appear in any known registry, monastic or royal. It was not Latin, nor French, nor anything that could be confidently translated. No one could recall who it was meant for. Inside, folded into precise quarters, was a single page covered in cramped handwriting. Unlike the others, it made no mention of forgetting, nor the abbey's fading rituals. Instead, it contained a passage that read more like a spell than a letter, filled with invocations and patterns of repetition. Words echoed with rhythm, looping through meaning until sense collapsed under their weight. The final line read, "If you find this, then something remains." The letter had no signature. It was as if someone within the abbey, perhaps toward the end, had begun writing not to people, but to memory itself, as if hoping that through ink and intention something of them would endure, even when the names, the sky, and the language had gone. After the abbey was sealed for the last time, the room that held the letters remained undisturbed. Dust softened their corners, pages yellowed, but the words, though faint, persisted, a testament not just to the minds that wrote them, but to the quiet desperation of remembrance. They were not cries for help nor records of final days. They were the echoes of presence, fractured, failing, but present. And still, that phrase lingers in the parchment, in the margins, in the air itself. We are still here, we are still in the heart of the abbey, past the scriptorium, and beneath the high walls that sheltered the cloister, lay a garden, once regarded as the monastery's quietest wisdom. It was not only a place of cultivation, but of continuity. For generations the monks had tended to it with quiet reverence, recording each planting, each sprout, each harvest with a devotion that bordered on ritual. The garden was considered a living archive, a memory that grew in leaves and roots when all else began to fade. At first it seemed spared from the forgetting. The lavender still bloomed in long pale rows. The mint clustered at the base of the southern wall, curling around the stones as it always had. The rosemary held its strong scent through early spring, while the basil warmed gently in the sunlight. Nothing appeared out of place, but with time, quiet changes crept in. The first notes in the garden journal were gentle, mentions of the thyme blooming a few weeks too early, or of a fig tree producing fruit with no memory of having flowered. The calendula, typically predictable in its orange flare, had begun to grow pale and petalless. A monk wrote with a kind of reverent confusion, "The roots are here, but they do not remember what to reach for." Botanical records began to diverge from reality. Flowers bloomed in strange cycles, out of season and sometimes in silence. The once reliable scents of sage, lemon balm, and marjoram grew faint, then absent. Petals opened but gave no fragrance, leaves unfurled, but with a waxen stillness that did not sway in wind. The monks noted these shifts, at first with curiosity, then with growing unease. The garden had once been their measure of time, the language of its life aligning with the turning of prayers, the shape of days. Now the markers had slipped, the rhythm had gone quiet. One entry in the logbook read simply, "The basil remembers, the rose, emery doesn't." What it meant, none could explain. Some herbs still responded to touch and light as expected. Others seemed to wilt when approached, folding in on themselves, even in full sun. The soil remained rich, but something deeper, something older, had been forgotten. Symbolically, the garden had always mirrored the monastery's state. In days of plenty, the vines reached higher. In grief, the soil grew dense and cool. Now it reflected something else entirely, not death, but disorientation. The garden had not died, it had simply lost its pattern. The oldest monks, those who had kept the garden for decades, began to avoid it. They claimed the rosemary had begun growing without scent, that the fennel had flowered with no seeds, that ivy moved subtly between stones it had never touched before. One monk, known for his patient tending of the herb rose, left behind a final note pinned into the soil with a sprig of thyme. "There is something here. It grows, but it does not belong." Even the bees, once constant companions to the garden's bloom, visited less and less. Without scent, there was little to guide them. Without memory, the flowers did not call. In the final season before the abbey's doors were sealed, the garden stood green but unfamiliar. A hush lingered there, not the peaceful silence of prayer, but a pause without return, as though the garden still wore the shape of its former life, but the essence, the memory of what it had been, had already drifted away. No records were kept beyond that point. The final page in the logbook remains empty, save for a smear of pollen pressed between the lines. Whatever wisdom had once rooted there had begun to dissolve, and the garden, faithful witness to years of devotion, simply forgot to bloom. In the days after the garden grew quiet, when the rhythms of the abbey seemed held together only by habit and the soft weight of routine, a new stillness arrived. He was first seen at dawn, standing just beyond the outer cloister wall, where mist gathered thickest and light was slow to come. A figure cloaked in grey, motionless, facing the abbey gates. He did not knock, nor did he speak. He remained there as if he had always been, not arriving, but simply remembered. At first the monks took no action. The stranger made no threat. He stood with the poise of prayer or patience, unmoved by sun or rain, unmoved even by the passing of days. By the third morning a few ventured to record his presence in the ledger of visitors, only to find the ink fading before the words were finished. By the seventh day no one could agree on when he had first appeared. There were no footprints in the gravel path leading to the gate, no markings in the soil, and yet he remained. Some believed he was a pilgrim who had lost his way. Others murmured that he had always been part of the abbey's horizon, forgotten only until now. But none could explain how each monk who tried to sketch him drew a different man. One depicted him tall and robed in black, faceless. Another showed a stooped figure with long hair braided with gold threads. A third drew only a shape, a shadow without feature, surrounded by an aura of fractured light. None of the depictions matched, yet all were said to be drawn from memory, and each monk insisted with quiet certainty, "This is what I saw." He never moved, yet he never stayed the same. When a novice approached the gate with quiet offerings, bread, water, a candle lit in the early hour, he returned to the abbey confused and wordless, unsure of what he had done or why. The candle was untouched, the bread still warm, but later the novice could not recall the shape of the pilgrim's presence, only that it had felt like standing in front of something very old and very empty. Some began to say he was not a visitor at all, but something the abbey itself had shaped, a byproduct of forgetting, or the memory of a man who had once mattered deeply and been erased too thoroughly. Others whispered a darker thought, that he was not forgotten, but the one who did the forgetting. In the old chapel records, a page was found with the phrase written faintly in the margins, "He does not come to speak, he comes to collect." No name was ever assigned to the figure, and no record of his departure was ever made. One morning the space where he had stood was simply bare again. The mist remained thick and unmoved, but the air no longer held the strange gravity of presence. It was as though a silence had been lifted, leaving only a question in its place. But after his vanishing, something subtle shifted within the abbey. A few monks who had once remembered only fragments of their own names could now recall them in full. One or two even began to recite prayers that had been lost. Yet others, those who had gazed too long at the pilgrim's shape, forgot things entirely, not only sacred texts, but the faces of their brothers. One monk, in a soft voice, asked what the sun looked like. The drawings of the figure were stored away, each in a different chamber, though none could be found again. And in the courtyard, beneath a thin layer of gravel where he once stood, someone found a small stone, carved smooth by time. It bore no image, no name, only a single line etched so finely it could barely be seen. To watch is to remember, to be watched is to forget. The abbey grew quieter after that. After the figure at the gate disappeared and the silence he left behind began to settle like dust, a new stillness took hold of the abbey, not of peace, but of pause, as though the very walls were waiting. The monks returned to their routines as best they could, though many were still hollowed by the gaps left in their memory. Yet something beneath the surface was shifting. It was during a quiet afternoon, while tending to the brittle bindings of old texts in the abbey's earliest archives, that a monk stumbled upon it. A book, heavy, bound in dark calfskin, tucked behind a broken shelf. Its title was simply Regula Prima, the First Rule. It was known to all, or so it was thought, the foundational guide written when the abbey was first raised, copied and preserved for centuries. But this copy was different. Pressed between pages near the end, a leaf of vellum had been sewn in backward, a page not present in any known version. It had been sliced from the binding with precision, then hidden inside another volume. Time had browned the edges, and the ink had softened into the texture of the page, but its content was unmistakable. It was written in the same hand as the rest of the rulebook. It was part of the original, but unlike the rest of the manuscript, so carefully arranged in lines of obedience, silence, and prayer, this page contained something else, a ritual. There were no headings, no framing words of caution, only a title centered at the top in faded script, concerning the Keeper of Names. What followed was a series of instructions, simple, specific, and deeply strange. It described a rite not meant for ordinary practice, but one tied to memory itself. It spoke of a name never to be spoken aloud, and a figure never to be depicted, a presence that could be summoned not to protect, but to preserve, to claim the names of things when time or man threatened to. Oh, forget them. It required silence, not only of the tongue, but of the mind. Thoughts cleared, identities surrendered briefly as an offering. The final part of the page was partially torn, but what remained was legible enough to chill. In calling the keeper, you do not seek return. You ask only that what was may not vanish entirely. But beware, for he does not give freely. He remembers on behalf of what no longer can. No record had ever mentioned this ritual. No monk recalled it being taught. And yet, there it was, ink on vellum, tucked between centuries of quiet obedience. In the margins, someone had written in a hand not belonging to the scribe, "This must not be read aloud, this must not be known." Below that, in even fainter lettering, "Removed by order, 1242. There was no mention in any surviving document of that decree, but the abbey's history in that year, like so many other things, was strangely empty. The discovery of the forgotten page sent a hush deeper than usual through the community. The rulebook was placed under lock and key, and no one spoke of it openly, but those who had seen it could not look at one another quite the same way afterward. Something in the text lingered, like the echo of a name just at the edge of hearing. In the days that followed, several monks reported dreams they could not describe, visions filled with parchment, wind, and the faint sound of pages turning on their own. And in the refectory, carved faintly into the wood of a table none remembered carving before, appeared a phrase that no one claimed to have written: "He remembers for all who forget." The ritual was never performed, but some believed it already had been. There was no fire, no siege or sign of violence, no record of plague, no hurried abandonment. The abbey's end did not come in thunder or in flame. It arrived in a single sound. At the time, the village nearest the hilltop monastery had already grown used to its strangeness. The monks' silence, their strange routines, their aging walls where ivy grew in shapes no one wished to describe. But one shepherd, a man known for speaking little and watching much, was the only one awake that morning when it happened. He would later try to explain it in his own way, not through story, but by tracing the air with his hands, describing something round, without edge, and so deep it did not rise or fall. A tone, he said, one long and level sound, too low to be called music, too steady to be a bell. It seemed to come from within the stone itself. Birds fled the trees before the sound even began. He remembered that clearly. A strange hush had settled. Then the earth held its breath. the sound lasted only minutes, perhaps less. Yet when it faded, the abbey above remained still, not crumbling, not broken, but final, a stillness beyond ordinary silence. Days later, when villagers dared approach, they found the outer doors of the abbey ajar. No monks came to greet them, no voices carried from within. Every hall stood untouched, every room preserved in mid-motion, candles burned down to pools of wax, robes left folded beside empty beds. Yet it was not abandonment that filled the space. It was something older, a kind of vacancy that felt intentional. There were signs, faint but unsettling. The bell tower's great bronze instruments were found melted in place, not shattered or rusted, but softened as though by heat that left no scorch. The organ pipes in the chapel were bent, their mouths warped like clay, yet the wood around them was unmarked. In the scriptorium, stone desks bore fine concentric cracks, spiralling outward like echoes frozen in the grain, and across one wall, high, near the vaulted ceiling, a thin hairline fissure had formed, tracing the shape of a circle. Not perfect, but deliberate, as though the sound had etched itself into the bones of the abbey. No bodies were found, no footprints led away. The monks, it seemed, had simply vanished. What lingered was resonance, not in the air, but in the walls, in the way sound refused to carry. Even the villagers noticed it. Whispered words would not echo. Steps made less noise than they should, as if the building itself had grown weary of sound. Of all that remained, only one object seemed truly out of place. In the centre of the abbey's library sat a single wooden stool. Resting on it was a bowl, plain ceramic glazed in green. It hummed softly, not audibly, but when touched, it vibrated, slightly, just enough to be noticed. It was taken down the hill and placed in the village's small church, far from its origin. It never made a sound again. The abbey was left untouched afterward. No one was assigned to reclaim it. Over time, ivy grew heavier. Seasons passed with more forgetting than remembrance, and eventually the hill was marked only on old maps. But still, on rare mornings, those who walk nearby say the air grows thinner just before dawn, that the birds pause their songs, and that sometimes, deep in the stone, they feel a sound without hearing it, a sound not made by anything living, nor meant for ears at all. Not a warning, not a call, just a memory, held longer than it was meant to be. Time wears everything down. Stone yields to rain, memory to dust, and even silence can crumble under enough years. But some things, not quite memories, not quite ghosts, stay longer than they should. And when the archivists came, centuries after the abbey's last sound, they didn't expect to find anything at all. The hill had long since gone unnamed on newer maps, marked only as a forestry zone, its path obscured by growth and erosion. The abbey itself had sunken into its ruin, not collapsed, but recessed, as if slowly withdrawing from the world around it. When the archivists arrived, they had no mission of faith or legend, only the gentle, methodical hope of historians. They were searching for footnotes, but what they found were traces. The stones still held the curve of halls and the outline of purpose. Rooms were intact, though partially overtaken by soil and moss. The library had fallen inward, yet its centre stool and the faded shape of a green-glazed bowl remained clearly visible in the dust. The archivists marked everything, measured carefully, and began cataloguing. Fragments were their first discoveries. Scraps of parchment sealed in glassine, the charred edge of a hymn book, a wax tablet whose inscriptions faded when exposed to air. Some documents were in Latin, others in older tongues, and one set bore symbols not linked to any known language. More puzzling was that several researchers claimed to recognize these unfamiliar symbols, though none could agree on their meanings. Each believed them to be letters from a language they once knew as children, though no such language had ever existed. Then came the chance. On a cylinder, misfiled in a travelling case of geological samples, a roll of film revealed not images but audio grooves, like an old wax recording, only flattened. When played back, it produced a sequence of tones, overlapping and breathless. No identifiable words, no instruments, just layers of voices moving in and out of one another. Listening for too long gave some researchers migraines. Others reported dreams of doorways they could not pass through. Journals surfaced in the scriptorium, pressed beneath collapsed beams. Most were half complete. Sentences trailed off. Dates looped or repeated, with entries marked "today" stretching across weeks. One recurring phrase appeared in at least 4 different hands. "We are still here. We are still," always ending there, unfinished. There was one envelope, sealed and unaddressed save for a single name. A name that belonged to no known person or saint, and yet produced a reaction when spoken aloud. The room would grow quiet. Devices malfunctioned. The wind outside would still. The envelope has never been opened. And through it all the researchers changed, subtly at first. A quietness in their voices, a hesitation in writing reports. Some forgot what day it was, others what year. One by one they stopped using the abbey's name altogether, even in notes. They simply referred to it as the site or the archive, as if naming it again would restore something better left buried. In time, the excavation was suspended, not closed, not sealed, just paused. Some say it's still being processed. Others, that those who worked there no longer speak of it, nor work at all. The findings were boxed, then boxed again, sent into storage where they wait. Labelled, but not categorized. Remembered, but not fully known. Because what remained of the abbey was never meant to explain. Its records were not truths, only residues. Its memory not passed down, but leaked, quietly, like damp through stone. And in the final page of the final report, unsigned and never submitted, there is one line written in small, precise hand. Some memories choose not to be remembered, and so they remain. J. Must out of reach, still here, still.